read Louis Markos's what was it? The Myth Made Fact.
Oh yeah.
And so I'm interested in this and in your perspective. And he's building that off of Lewis.
Right.
And Lewis kind of paints this picture, and I want to be careful I don't like go too far with this and over explain what Luther's talking about. But he'll say Christ obviously, is the fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures. But there's this sense too where he even fulfills kind of the pagan tract.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe one of the good examples is when, who is it? Is it Thomas or Philip who brings the Greeks to Jesus?
Oh yeah.
And, and then Jesus, and it, in the Bible, like it almost like cuts it off in some of the translations where it's almost as if what Jesus says next is not to the Greeks, but it seems pretty obvious. Like he introduces the Greeks to Jesus, and then Jesus then talks about the kernel that goes into the ground and it must die in order to give life for the plant to grow up. And I think Louis Markos makes the claim that there's a very popular Greek myth attached to one of their gods of this dying and rising.
Right.
And Lewis's main point, at least, and Markos gets to this, is that people have come out and said, oh, like Jesus is just a retelling of Osiris or some of these, pagan gods who die and rise. And Lewis's whole point is, so Christians have sometimes pushed back against that. And Lewis's point is like, no, you should embrace that. The fact that they had these mythologies of a dying, rising God, they can't fully in their memory is stored the reality of the fall. And of course they should have this because it is the ultimate reality. So of course they're going to gesture towards this. They're kind of groping in the dark. But he says, embrace that. That should actually enhance and solidify the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Not that it's just a retelling of a myth, but it's the myth made historical fact.
Right.
So I don't know what your thoughts are on kind of the way Markos and Lewis go about that.
Yeah, I love it. And I agree with it. I think that what we have we have two things going on. I think, first of all, we just have the reality that we were created for a Messiah, right? So, we have this sort of Augustine thing that I was restless until I found my rest in you. And, we have this, we need this. And so if we don't have it, we try to make it up, right? There is this. And then, of course, we're interested mostly in stories of atonement, in stories of sacrifice, in stories that kind of, right? Otherwise, it's really, and really, this is fun. I think you just think about this in the next few days. Every story is a love story, or it's not a story. We have no interest if it's not a love story. When I can remember in like grade school, you were taught, this story. It was this man versus man, or man versus nature, or man versus, right? Remember that kind of, did you ever have to learn?
No.
Oh, that was like an old literature way of, and it's like, no, it's actually what you got to figure out where the conflict is and where the resolution is where is love?
Mm-hmm.
It's always about love. And I think, again, that's because that's what we were meant for, because God is love.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's that side of it. I think the other side of it, and I think that's mostly Markos and Lewis. They'd argue from that point of view. And I'm surprised they don't bring this much up, though. Maybe Marcus does. There's also, I think, a cultural memory.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? Like dinosaurs, right, are probably remembered in culture as dragons.
Yeah.
Or,
and
right,
they're all over.
Worldwide flood of Gilgamesh. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this like cultural memory of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And that, they're imitating us. We're not imitating them.
Mm-hmm.
But Lewis and I think Marcus want to say that they're also expressing a longing for the real story.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Lewis says, I forget where, it might've been in Paralandra. I feel like it was in one of his fictional pieces, but he does talk about how man is always haunted by the taking of the fruit.
Oh, nice.
And that is always in the backdrop of our memory. Like there's that, we can never shed that, And to your point about like a love story, every story that moves us often has like sacrifice too, which is a component of love. But like everyone is always moved, whether you're a Christian or not, everyone is always moved by someone who's willing to lay down their life. Right. And the reason is because one does have to lay down their life. Like that is built into us. We know that has to take place, and it takes place historically in its ultimate reality in Christ. Yeah. But that is why we love these other stories.
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, like you're telling the story about the Maccabee boys.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to be a Christian you could, that could be a story about Sparta.
Mm-hmm.
The mother saying to her son, come back with your shield or on it,
mm-hmm.
That sort of thing. because we do recognize the sort of that's about love,
Mm-hmm.
right? Those Spartans are doing that for love of country and love of family, and that's admirable.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a kind of fascinating thing, but I do think it's really useful to recognize it as love,
Mm-hmm.
But then also you could see just how people love the wrong things.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's the other, it is fun. It's, I like the idealistic hero idea, but you can't really have an idealistic villain.
Yeah.
Right. The villain has to have a motivation, and it will, it's a disordered love typically.
Mm-hmm.
But right. So even in the Lord of the Rings, right, Saruman, right, starts out trying to manipulate things.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes awry and takes control, or, I'm going to use the ring for good.
Yeah.
Like Boromir or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's this notion of you will try to use the ring, but the ring will use you.
Yeah.
And that certainly, Boromir, that's a great example, right? He's very virtuously wants to use the ring to save Gondor.
Right.
And the lesson is he can't.
But he doesn't love, it's a disordered love.
Yeah.
Right. It's not quite in the right thing. And so I think this is helpful too when we think about resisting sin. And we have to kind of recognize that what is it that we're using the sin for?
Mm-hmm.
Or it's helpful, I think, if we go, okay, well, I want to whatever. I mean, I'm trying to do something that's not too tantalizing or awful, but I want to steal this thing because I want it. I mean, what I want is the thing, which isn't necessarily evil in itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that I want it away from the way God has given it.
Yeah.
And so I'm loving it, but I'm loving it apart from the love of God, and I'm loving it for itself rather than loving it within the order that God has established.
Aquinas talks about this, and I could be 10, 20 degrees off trying to articulate this right. But I think the way he says it is evil is always an absence of good.
Yes. And
so his point, he uses the example of Satan, and I'm trying to remember what it was with Satan, but the easier one is the Hitler example, right? Where it's like, what did Hitler want? Like Hitler wanted some kind of restoration of Germany.
Yeah.
Right? That is good. How did he go about doing it? Right. He did it by what was missing was certainly a love of neighbor or a love of proper justice, right? So like there were absences of loves, and therefore the one love became a tyrannical love, or a tyrannical good that became evil, right? So it's like that's how he describes all evil, is it's like there's one good without the other ones,
right? Yeah, I think that Satan can't create. It's back to that only killing.
Mm-hmm.
So evil's always a lack. Poverty's a lack of wealth. Hunger's a lack of food, right? War's a lack of peace. And so, because there is no substance to evil.
Mm-hmm.
And that's Aquinas, and Augustine. And I think that is also a very helpful thing to recognize. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.